to all our colleagues and friends of the International Crisis Group. My name is Comfort Ero, and I'm the Interim Vice President and Director of Crisis Group's Africa Programme. I'm sincerely appreciative of your presence, even if I can't see all of you. I know that you're there. For those of you who are not familiar with Crisis Group's work, let me take a brief moment to tell you briefly about who we are. Crisis Group, a 25-year-old organization, an independent organization working to prevent wars and to shape policies that can sustain and build peace. Our mandate is to engage all parties and to support efforts to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent and deadly conflict. We do this by sounding the alarm bell, providing independent and field-based high-quality analysis, and engaging directly with all conflict actors and key international players, like many of you who are joining us on the call today, with the aim of encouraging and informing and providing sort of intelligent action that can help shift the policy dial towards a sustainable outcome. This afternoon, we're all connected for a rather important public exchange with our European policy community, looking at the critical intersection between technology and violent conflict, and exchange on ways in which technology, and in particular social media, is transforming conflicts or fragile political settings. It's also a very timely moment for those of you who have been following developments in Nigeria and the current fallout there following the president's decision to suspend Twitter. And that sort of action is a reminder to many of us of how sort of social media continues to be a double-edged sword in certain contexts as well that we work in. I'm very pleased today that our participants include policy practitioners, regional experts, El Salvador, Venezuela, Cameroon, for example, and Myanmar, and diplomats working on peace and security within the European Union, amongst its member states, as well as colleagues from civil society and international organizations. So we've got quite a diverse group of experts that are going to engage in this very sort of important and timely conversation that we're having today. Let me also take this opportunity to mention that the event that we're conducting today is being recorded and is live on stream via our website, www.crisisgroup.org, and also via our YouTube channel. You can interact with questions and comments in the event page, and we do encourage you to sort of be animated in your discussion and to also use social media for the conversation, because, you know, while we're talking about the use of social media in conflict, also does lend itself to be naturally a very important platform to raise these concerns. Please use the hashtag.
Recording in progress.
If you are going to engage in the conversation, we are using the hashtag called hashtag Crisis Talks as well. Our talks today, Crisis Talks, will be structured around 2 sessions covering a number of case studies for all of you. In the very first session, we'll address the role of state actors, looking at how these state actors often sort of use social media to their advantage to either shape public narratives around their interest, or, as we've seen in certain contexts, to constrain the access and voice of opposition groupings as well as civil society as well. And then in the second section, we will then turn our attention to those very opposition groupings and civil society, but looking particularly at non-state actors, and discuss how they have intervened and used social media in the various conflict dynamics that we'll be looking at as well. And these are a range of case studies that we're looking at, as I mentioned, El Salvador, Venezuela, Myanmar, and Cameroon as well. And in all these issues have become of greater relevance with the expanding digital space in all aspects of our life, and also also this is true, as we've seen at Crisis Group and in other places, in the fragile context in which we work in. And it's very clear to us by the research that we have done in all these various places, including Libya. I should add, coming up with very compelling evidence that more attention is required to equip various institutions, conflict actors and practitioners with the appropriate understanding and capacity sort of to act to prevent conflicts that might be nourished by harmful rhetoric, by hate speech and misinformation in the digital age. And this question is even more crucial to our colleagues at the European Union and its member states who have welcomed this conversation with Crisis Group, which is why we're having this public conversation today. And it's even more central because in a number of the spaces and where we're operating, in a number of the conflict settings that we're talking about, European actors are very important players right at the center of some of these conflicts that we're going to address today, whether it's in Venezuela or Myanmar or Libya or Cameroon. And, so a more granular understanding of the role of sort of new technologies and social media can significantly increase the conflict sensitivity of diplomatic engagement, of conflict prevention initiatives, and also support various programs, for example, those that are initiated by the European Union as well. And indeed, this crisis talk is also part of Crisis Group's own ongoing collaboration now with the European Union. And I wish to acknowledge the partnership with the European Union Commission through the instrument contributing to stability and peace, and the collaboration with the European External Action Services also. And also, as a testimony to this lively cooperation, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Simon Borgensen-Moller, and I hope I didn't spoil your name, and I really welcome you into this virtual room, Simon. Simon is the acting head of Unit for Stability and Peace at the European Union's Commission Services for Foreign Policy Instruments. And that Stability and Peace unit at the Commission manages the EU's conflict prevention, peace building and crisis response in approximately 70 countries around the world at any one point. And it is a leading partner in those areas where Crisis Group encourages the EU and works collaboratively with the European Union to share, think through policy initiatives and to think through the pathways out of a number of crises that we're working on as well. Before joining the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments in 2018, Simon worked for 14 years in the EU delegation in the Middle East, including over 10 years in Syria, where he also served as acting head of delegation and head of public affairs, political affairs in the EU delegations in Libya, Jordan, and Yemen. So he comes with vast experience, and he would have seen how social media had played out in a number of these settings. Simon holds a master's in interdisciplinary European studies. And Simon, it's a real pleasure to have you here with us today. Thank you very much for making yourself available. And I hope that we'll have a really good back and forth to enrich our talks. I'm going to hand over the floor to you, the virtual floor, for your introductory remarks. Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you very much, Comfort. I'm very happy to be here to offer a few opening remarks on behalf of the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments, which is very happy to support this event and to have a long-standing partnership with the International Crisis Group. We now have this event financed through a project on strengthening EU early warning, conflict prevention and crisis response. And I think today's discussion is right on what we wanted to have out of this project, and I'm looking very much forward to the discussion. So when we started our collaboration with ICG back in 2013, social media was perhaps not an obvious subject for conflict talk, but today it definitely is. The COVID pandemic has dramatically increased the attention and the funding given to the subject of social media, disinformation, conflict, and peace. We're now all familiar with the potentially harmful online content, or the potential harmful online content has to fuel tensions and trigger outbreaks of violence. We have seen how vulnerable most societies are to efforts to polarize opinions and to undermine public trust, either in state authority or in other cases in civil society organizations. And these are dynamics we've seen in Europe, we've seen them in the US and throughout the world. And obviously the effects of these dynamics are much more harmful in contexts that are already suffering from conflict. So while we've seen dynamics play out in this field for a few years, we are yet fully to grasp the magnitude of these new drivers of conflict. So while propaganda and campaigns of hate have always been used to shape popular representation or to mobilize support in times of crisis and war, we are not used to seeing it at the scale and the speed that we're seeing now with the rise of social media as a main source of information and of social interaction for many of us. So in order to better respond to these dynamics, the first thing we have to do is to understand them better. We need to analyze how disinformation campaigns are being orchestrated and why they're being orchestrated. We need to gather more facts and evidence about the links between online harm and offline violence to better understand how the dynamics are. We need to understand the context in which these information flows are developed, and very importantly, who the local actors and local narratives are that are best placed to respond and counter this harmful content. So within the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments, we have supported many initiatives over the years in response to violent extremist propaganda and narratives. But it's only in the last couple of years that we're stepping up our engagement with the social media companies as well, to engage with them in a conversation on the issue of conflict and peace building in a broader sense. So while the social media platforms are starting to realize their corporate responsibilities, and which is something we very much welcome, their engagement in conflict-affected context is still marginal and need to be further encouraged, and very importantly, to be accompanied as well. And we believe that through collaboration with social media platforms, with peace builders, civil society, activists, academics, and technical experts, we, as well as, of course, the regulatory bodies, will be able to raise awareness of particular situations where we need more attention. We've seen that happen in the past with election processes, and we hope we can also broaden that to further processes, and then to help find appropriate action in terms of moderation and management of algorithms and so forth. So I will not take more time from the discussion now. I will just thank you very much for organizing this event and giving us the opportunity to exchange and learn from the speakers and from the participants today. Thank you very much, Comfort.
Thank you very much, Simon. And you sort of laid out sort of all the key issues that we need to cover, understand very much what is happening on the ground, and then to think through the various ways in which we can respond to those issues as well. Before handing over to my colleague, our Director of Communications, Hugh Pope, who will moderate the panel sessions for us this afternoon, let me first launch a short video. I'm very excited to launch this video where our interim Director for our Future of Conflict program, and our Chief Strategist, Rob Bletcher, and our Senior Analyst on social media, Jane Esberg, will introduce Crisis Group's work on the future of conflict and social media. Thank you all, and I wish you all a very good, productive afternoon also. Thank you.
We've been developing our future of conflict over the past few years. It has three pillars. The first is technology and conflict, with a special focus on social media. Second is climate and conflict, which looks at climate as a threat multiplier that exacerbates other conflict risks. And third, the economics of conflict, which uses innovative data and economic techniques to explore war economies and the role of the private sector in the peace and security realm. Our future of conflict work starts from the same premise that all crisis group work does, that putting local, granular research at the center of our analysis yields the most important insights for preventing and resolving conflict. That's why all of our thematic work is done jointly with our regional work so that the two reinforce each other.
Social media has just fundamentally changed how we communicate, what information we see, whose ideas we see. And this has come with greater opportunities for freedom of information, government accountability, and online activism. For many, this was really exemplified by the Arab Spring, which some dubbed the Twitter revolution. But social media has also been used to exacerbate conflicts, in some cases strategically. Misinformation and disinformation, hate speech, and propaganda have all affected conflict dynamics. In the Rohingya crisis, Myanmar's military fed an existing ethno-religious tension to its boiling point, often through false or misleading information designed to vilify the Muslim minority, which caused widespread violence and drove hundreds of thousands of Rohingya from the country. ISIS has used social media for propaganda and recruitment, including in the West. During the Israel-Palestine conflict, we saw the organization of anti-Palestinian violence via WhatsApp. But there are also a lot of positive dimensions to social media. It's allowed greater communication among activists, increasingly allowing citizens to directly challenge their governments. In areas where traditional media is largely state-controlled, it offers independent sources of information, and it's been critical in tracking and disseminating information about human rights and conflict dynamics on the ground. The International Crisis Group's research often highlights these tensions. Social media has been central to activism after Myanmar's coup, even though the military previously used it to fuel violence. Social media has provided independent sources of news in Cameroon, even as it facilitates hate speech. Social media has been important for the Venezuelan opposition, increasingly in exile, to communicate among one another, but it is reflecting and exacerbating polarization as well. Social media companies and governments are struggling to govern online spaces in a way that preserves this freedom of expression but doesn't actually fuel violence. And this is in part a challenge because of the unique dynamics of different crises and how social media influences these dynamics. Reducing harm will require understanding the impact of social media and moderation policies on specific conflicts.
Slido. This is the platform you will have to use if you want to ask questions. You can do this in two ways. One is to interact with the dedicated page on our website, just below the YouTube stream on our website, or by joining Slido directly. You may have to do this if your cookies are blocking it on the website. So you go to slido.com or slide.do and enter the code #ICG under join as participant. And if you're all seeing it now, I'd like to just try with a first poll. It'll be pretty easy. It'll also give us a nice idea of the audience we have with us today. So if you could slide that onto the screen, colleagues, and we'll see if we can get this to work. So just a few minutes to well, a few seconds to have a look. I'm sure it's a pretty easy question. And there we go. 3 so far. 5. Okay, it's slido.com or slide.do. Okay, let this run a bit. It's a just to add to Simon's point about how important social media has become. I'll just keep talking while you fill in that poll. One amazing thing is that more than half of the world's population are now active social media users. So it's hardly surprising that it's become a natural extension of the conflict environments in which Crisis Group specializes. And the other amazing part of that is, on average, these 4.2 billion users have accounts on 8 different platforms and spend 2.5 hours per day on social media. I got that information from a new overview by Swisspeace and the UN, which is a very interesting source of information on the impact of social media on mediation. Social media is obviously also playing an increasing role in armed conflicts. It impacts how conflict actors communicate with one another and with the public, how information is disseminated, how the outside world perceives conflicts, and most fundamentally, how armed conflicts are increasingly fought. Simon and Jane have pointed out the negatives and positives. So let's try another panel. Let's see where we've got to on this. With 25 people have found their way to Slido. Okay, let's just try the second poll, colleagues, and see whether we can try this again before we go to the first panel. And this will be to judge what you think the role of social media in conflict is. So if we could slide that new poll on there, we have a fairly clear result from the sample of 26 who are able to answer the first question, with 2/3 having some knowledge and about a quarter having Okay, here we go with the second one. What role, in your view, will social media play in fragile contexts in the future? Looks like everyone's getting into this faster. It's the positives, obviously, state mediators and conflict prevention organizations like our own crisis group can listen to social media to know more about a conflict, to hear independent views, to find out what the opposition is thinking, and right down to a very granular level. At the same time, states and mediators and everyone can use the social media to shape the messages. So you can also, the democratic opposition is also can use it. So it's positive. The negatives, obviously, sensationalism has an exaggerated impact. There are myriad inauthentic, coordinated campaigns using the famous bots and sometimes troll farms and so forth. Relatively few users are producing most of the content, which is a dangerous side of things. And then increasingly, many social media platforms are actually closed. You can't see what's going on, and they're encrypted. So let's see where we've got that. We've got 29 of our guests have looked, and 2/3 think that it is growing increasingly problematic. And only 1/10 think that there is it's going to enable or strengthen freedom of speech or democratization. That's interesting. So a pessimistic audience. Let's see. So that's right. Thanks for doing our first 2 ever online polls at International Crisis Group. That was great. And we will now turn to our first panel. This panel is dealing with social media and state actors in conflict. And so there's very much what officialdom and state institutions can do. And for this, you've already seen Jane Esberg speaking on the video, and she's going to address, I think, about El Salvador. Jane is our Crisis Group's fellow on economics and conflict, and she's also coming to join us full-time as the senior analyst for social media and conflict. And what Jane does is she integrates quantitative and text analysis methods with Crisis Group's work on criminal and political violence, with a regional focus, especially on Latin America. Jane is a visiting fellow at Princeton University, and her PhD in political science comes from Stanford University. And her dissertation used original microdata to study the relationship between popular support and repression during Chile's authoritarian regime. So welcome, Jane. And I'm going to be asking the same question to all our panelists as they come on. And that is, we see governments often actively working to use social media nowadays to their advantage, whether by monitoring and limiting the opposition's communication capacities, or like in Nigeria, switching the whole of Twitter off, or spreading their own messages. From your perspective, can you just give us an outline of how you see state actors using social media and how that is actually affecting conflicts today?
Great, thanks so much, Hugh. So as you mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on some research that I did with Crisis Group on El Salvador. There are really very few places in the world right now where Twitter is more central to politics than El Salvador. The president, Nayib Bukele, uses memes and hashtags to communicate his policy positions, respond to critics. He regularly uses the platform to attack his opponents. The Economist ran a story about him called "My Tweet is Your Command." Our research on El Salvador highlights how social media can really polarize debates over how to solve conflict, in this case over security policy dealing with gang violence. Fights between Bukele and his critics often play out online because of the central importance of Twitter to his administration. Bukele's really flagship success in El Salvador is that he oversaw a historic drop in the murder rate, which for years was among the highest in the world due to gang violence. But in doing so, he has pursued controversial hardline policies, including violating human rights through extrajudicial killings and prison overcrowding. In trying to fund his security bill, he had the military occupy the legislature. So his supporters say he's brought peace and security, and his critics say he's eroding democracy. So to explore this dynamic, we did an analysis of two competing hashtags that were popular about a year ago. Hashtag Bukele Dictador focuses on Bukele as a human rights violator and dictator, with tweets like prohibited from thinking, forbidden from dissenting, Bukele Dictador, God will judge you, tyrant. Que bonita dictadora, or what a lovely dictatorship, painted Bukele as this bearer of peace. Most often, these tweets showed the police or the military doing a good deed, like carrying a bag of rice for an elderly woman, with text like, "Is this what a dictatorship looks like?" So What a Lovely Dictatorship was clearly designed by pro-government leaders. The hashtag was first used by a communication strategist who the newspaper El Faro alleged ran a propaganda machine for an ex-prosecutor who's now in prison. The strategist used the hashtag 3 times in rapid succession, then 2 hours later published a story about its explosion on social media on a digital publication that he himself owns, even though at the time it had only been used 620 times. Most of the images showing the military doing good were from Bukele's communications department. And these messages were then artificially boosted. So while it's difficult to firmly identify evidence of bots or trolls online for a variety of reasons, there's really good reason to believe that they are being used in El Salvador. Both Bukele and the opposition party, the FMLN, have been accused of being involved in troll centers, which are a bunch of young people being paid to post particular messaging online, often under multiple accounts. One way of seeing suspicious accounts is to look at when they were created. So I'm going to show a graph that shows when the accounts that used these two hashtags were created. Hopefully you can see it on Slido shortly. So as Twitter basically removes and identifies suspicious accounts, new ones have to replace them. So one of the easiest ways to see some evidence of suspicious accounts is to see a boost in brand new accounts. So in total, in the period we studied, about 5% of Bukele Dictador tweets and 6% of What a Lovely Dictatorship posts came from accounts that were deactivated within a month, which is a signal that Twitter itself found these users suspicious. A disproportionate number of accounts were created very recently, another signal of inauthentic activity, since starting new accounts is the cheapest way to replace those that were removed. But overshadowing this is a spike in the creation of pro-government accounts the week that Bukele took office. So hundreds of new pro-Bukele accounts were created in the course of just a couple of days. And this is really suspicious. We would expect a much smoother bump in accounts created if this were about joining to champion Bukele or about other important events like Bukele's election or military occupation of the legislature. Don't come with that same bump. In one day, more accounts were created than in the entire previous month that used this pro-Bukele hashtag. And what this suggests is the building of a network of pro-government accounts that are designed to boost the messaging of the administration. What we're seeing is obviously not unique to El Salvador. We're seeing the government use Twitter as a tool to inflame and polarize and simplify political debate in El Salvador, and exacerbating these trends in offline conflict. But this has very real consequences for El Salvador's politics, both online and offline, in an area of kind of the greatest central importance to El Salvador, which is gang violence. How to maintain these reductions in gang violence is going to be one of the great policy challenges of the Bukele administration moving forward, and it will require broad buy-in and a sustainable policy that both addresses sources of conflict and respects human rights. And the polarized debate that we're seeing is not conducive to this kind of long-term solution for gang violence. So what we're seeing here is social media inflaming a pre-existing conflict to make it harder to solve offline violence. So I think that those are my comments for now. I'm looking forward to questions, and I'll hand it back to Hugh.
Thanks very much, Jane. Just a quick follow-up question. Do you see much that in countries like El Salvador that seem to far away, is there much that the EU can do to intervene to counter the violent agendas while at the same time supporting media freedom? And is what you saw in El Salvador typical for what of all the other countries you've studied these phenomena in?
So on the EU question, I mean, this is obviously a central difficulty in designing policy around these issues, is that this is happening on an independent platform. So this is really about pressuring companies to address the use of trolls and bots online. Right now, that's partially a really technical question. It's very hard to identify these kinds of accounts. And what you don't want to do is remove a bunch of users who are just using Twitter or Facebook in a way that you don't recognize as normal. You know, often the tools that we have to identify bots really were built on Western audiences and were built on younger audiences. And so often you see statistics about the number of followers of Bukele, for instance, who are bots or trolls, and that's probably a pretty large overestimate because the users that follow him might be just using Twitter in a way that we don't understand, using a lot of retweets, not posting a lot of original content. But I think that what we can do is look at kind of ways of supporting and boosting voices that are much more moderate, helping civil society to more effectively use social media, and obviously there's a great debate over algorithmic changes in content about the degree to which the algorithms that run Twitter, Facebook, these social media platforms artificially boost controversial policies and automatically kind of push them further to the front. There's also, and I touched on this last, there have been pretty sustained attacks on the critics of Bukele from a variety of high-level politicians, and often this is very gendered. Sometimes this involves doxing. Attacks like that are very direct and that are coming from a wide network, I think can be more actively suppressed and dealt with more quickly because they often arise very, very fast, and having networks and the ability for platforms to be able to address those quickly as they come up will require the cooperation of civil society, of governments, of people tracking them, greater moderation, all of the things that we talk about quite often and we will hear again and again during these talks. I'm sorry, what was your second question, Hugh?
Just how typical is what you saw in El Salvador to the phenomena that you've studied elsewhere?
I think this is very typical. I think it varies by government, the degree to which they have access to these things like troll farms. Latin America there have been a lot of cases where governments and opposition have been accused of using troll farms. But if you pay close attention to kind of any controversial topic, you'll see certain kind of markers of inauthentic activity, like the reposting of the same message again and again and again. We see this in both Western countries and the global South. So I think it's very common and very indicative. I think that the difference in El Salvador is that it's touching on this area of gang violence that in an ideal world should be nonpartisan, and that should be focused on really solving for long-term solutions, and that should not have this kind of vitriol and attacks from both sides really kind of dominating the online sphere. But I do think that it is unfortunately pretty common. The degree to which it affects politics, I think, varies quite a bit. Sometimes you see these messages being boosted in a way that does not necessarily reach real users. You don't see a lot of engagement. There's a fair amount of engagement with these posts in El Salvador, in part because this has been a focus of Bukele's administration. That social media is central to his government and central to his popularity in a way that he recognizes and the opposition recognizes.
Thanks very much, Jane. Okay, we're now going to turn to Anita Godes, but can I suggest that the colleagues put the next Slido poll on so we can have that on while I introduce her, which will be asking about what the EU can do in the audience's mind about the social media problems that we've got. And while I hope we'll be able to get that on, but meanwhile, our second speaker is Anita Godes, who's a professor of international and cybersecurity at the Hertie School in Berlin. Her research focuses on contentious policies in the cyber realm, especially on large-scale quantitative analysis of state behavior. Previously, she was assistant professor of international relations at the University of Zurich, and since 2009, she has worked for the California-based nonprofit organization Human Rights Data Analysis Group. She currently advises the German Federal Foreign Office and has consulted for the World Bank and the United Nations on security and state fragility. And just before you start in, Anita, let's let everyone try and answer this. We have 10 replies. Let's leave that going, and perhaps we'll start listening to Anita, because I'm going to ask the same question to you. We've heard what Jane said about the government in El Salvador and more broadly in Latin America. And we've seen monitoring and limiting of opposition communication capacity, spreading their own messages. What, from your perspective, do you think is the most important impact this has on conflict?
Thank you, Hugh. Yeah, so I'd like to give a slightly broader perspective on how governments make use of social media in conflict and in situations of general political unrest. So I think what's interesting in this fits with what Jane was saying at the end of her presentation, that we see that this strategy is something that is being pursued both by democratic and non-democratic governments. So we see this being used in Western democracies, but also in many authoritarian countries. And this indicates the importance of engaging with online discourse in context with both high and low levels of traditional media freedom. So I think we sometimes have this relatively traditional idea that it's going to be more important to engage on social media in cases where the traditional media environment is more or less free, but we actually see governments doing it in both of these contexts. And so I think that is an important indication that the digital sphere really can't be ignored, regardless of what the rest of your media situation looks like. In terms of the actions that we see being used, I think it's useful to distinguish between direct actions by governments, for example, through their own accounts where they identify themselves, their official accounts, and then indirect actions, for example, by semi-governmental groups or just groups that are in support of the government and might not even be paid. And so I think there's quite a big distinction there. In a global study looking at the official accounts from governments themselves, so heads of state and heads of government, together with colleagues, we looked at this direct social media engagement. And one of the things we find, again, across democracies and non-democracies, is that these official government accounts are oftentimes used to divert attention away from political unrest. So in the context of political unrest, so protests moving towards broader contentious events such as riots or actually moving towards armed conflict, we see that this coincides with diversion on the official channels of the government. And so I think that's quite interesting, because we'll oftentimes find that government supporting groups or semi-governmental groups will directly engage with contentious events, while the official accounts are kind of trying to divert attention away. When it comes to these semi-governmental groups, we see diversion, we see this cheerleading that Jane was talking about, but we also see direct threatening actions and attacks against supporters of the opposition in a more aggressive way. So this is one way where we see direct social media engagement by state actors and semi-state actors, but we also see social media being used to monitor the activity of opposition groups. And I think an important point here that is oftentimes forgotten is that it's not only about members of the opposition or critics of the government within the country we're talking about, but it's also oftentimes the diaspora. And so I think this is opening up a new dimension of both surveillance and repression that is transnational and that we still have relatively limited evidence and work on. So I think this is really something we need more evidence on. The third is a little bit more meta in the comment that I want to make here, and that is that we're increasingly seeing governments appropriating the so-called fake news discourse and the need for content moderation for their own advantages. And so I've been studying censorship now for a long time, and we saw about 10 years, 15 years ago that a lot of governments were kind of covertly using censorship. And we've kind of now seen this move towards being much more overt and much more kind of, how would we say, self-confident in the use of censorship strategies, because they very nicely dovetail onto this idea of we need to moderate content. Social media is principally inciting violence, and this might actually mean that we have a very clear reason to curb disinformation through censorship. And so I think this is a very delicate balance that a lot of governments that are caught within conflict within their own countries are now abusing.
Thanks very much, Anita. Since we have a very Europe-focused audience today, do you think you could also have a go answering that question about is there more that the EU could do about it? We have 54% of our audience thinks that the EU could do more. If that was to be the case, what can happen?
Well, yes, I think we can. And I, coming from a European institution myself and being based in Berlin, I think the discussion around hate speech, the regulation of hate speech, fake news, disinformation on social media is a very important one that we're currently having. And the EU, I think, is one of the kind of pioneers when it comes to regulating these different types of content. But I think we really have to take into account the unintended consequences of this discourse when it comes to providing opportunistic discourse to other actors that might say, well, you know, what we're seeing at the moment is fake news, and this is, you know, the potential to incite harm. And so what we're actually doing here in terms of shutting down the internet, in terms of shutting down social media, is actually promoting peace. So I think taking care of this, or being aware of these unintended consequences is very important for our policymakers as well. The second point I think that is really important is thinking more about how we can promote transparency within social media companies. So there's been a lot of discussion about how social media companies are principally listening to policymakers in Europe and North America. And so I think promoting transparency when it comes to how social media companies comply with requests for takedown of content, for example, in conflict affected regions is something that we can do within the EU as well. We're seeing a lot of content not only being taken down, but downgraded in terms of the algorithm, so fewer people see it. If we think of apps such as TikTok, they don't even have to necessarily delete the content, just fewer people get to see it. We talk about shadow banning. So I think all of these things require more transparency, and this is something where European regulators really have a lot of potential.
And then just briefly, I was struck by you have an overview of the whole scene. Is social media censorship and all these issues censorship has been with us since Roman times? I mean, what is different about social media that makes it so special that we should organize panels about it?
So one of the comparisons I think that's really interesting is thinking about traditional surveillance infrastructure. So a lot of states have surveillance infrastructure for, nefarious reasons or for good reasons. But that infrastructure is usually in the olden times, it was traditionally built for one single purpose, and that was to provide information to the state. When we think about how social media works as a form of surveillance infrastructure, it is very much dependent on people adopting it themselves. And so it's a very different type of infrastructure that we're talking about. And it's actually much less costly for states to exploit, if you think about it, because people are very excited to use it. And so that brings with it a lot of advantages for states. They can access new members of the population. They can access new regions where they usually weren't able to access information. On the other hand, it's now also democratizing information. And so that information is not only being collected for the governments themselves, but it's being weaponized by non-state groups as well. And so it creates these new interesting trade-offs. And it's one of the reasons why we're seeing states being so dynamic in their censorship policies. They'll censor, uncensor the internet, block, unblock social media, because sometimes it's an advantage and sometimes it's a disadvantage.
Great. Thanks very much, Anita. I'm sure we'll be coming back to these topics. And just for those who didn't see the result of the poll, do you think the EU is doing enough to influence state actors and prevent harmful agendas being spread? 54% said the EU could do more, 25% had no opinion, and 21% said the EU cannot be a decisive player. So thanks for putting that poll up. And now we'll move on to Tom Keane, who knows all about social media blockages and on-off and and things. He's going to talk to us about Myanmar. Tom is a crisis group consultant on Myanmar and Bangladesh, and has contributed to extraordinarily vivid briefings and reports on topics ranging from the Rohingya crisis to the peace process to, of course, the latest dramas after the coup in Myanmar. Outside of his ICG work, he's a journalist and editor who has been working in Myanmar for the past 13 years, since January 2008. He edited the English edition of the Myanmar Times for 6 years before joining the web platform Frontier Myanmar. So welcome to you, Tom. Thanks for joining us from there. I think in Myanmar, we clearly saw the government trying to use the social media to its advantage, initially before the coup, and now it is using it as probably a fairly blunt instrument. Can you tell us more about how this is working and how it's affecting the conflict in your country?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. Yeah, it's really important when we look at social media and conflict in Myanmar to think about it in terms of BC and AC, that is before the coup and after the coup. I say this because the military takeover has really shifted the conflict dynamics so much over the past 4.5 months, and that's been reflected on social media. So before February 1, we had two competing centers of state power, the NLD and the Tatmadaw, as Myanmar's military is known. And while they were in competition with each other at a national political level, in elections and so on, when it came to most of the country's armed conflicts, for example, with the Rohingya, which Jane mentioned earlier, and also the Rakhine, the Arakan army, they were largely on the same page. But now they're competing on the battlefield and in the streets rather than in the corridors of power. The National Unity Government, which is the parallel administration formed by the opposition since the coup, is trying to ally with ethnic armed groups, ethnic minorities more broadly. So their messaging and policies are quite different from those of the NLD prior to the coup. They're much more conciliatory. They've promised a genuine federal democracy, which is something that minorities have been striving for decades, and also to the Rohingya specifically, citizenship and reform of the citizenship law. So this political shift has dramatically changed the discourse on social media in Myanmar. Although there's still a lot of suspicion on all sides, suspicion of the NUG from minorities, for example. The anger at the Tatmadaw since the coup has had a unifying effect, and it has really left very little space for pro-military voices on social media, particularly Facebook. The other important change we've seen since the coup, and this is probably something that that many of you have heard about, is the platforming of the Myanmar military. Facebook banned the Tatmadaw in late February, along with state media outlets that were now under military control. And other platforms like YouTube have also taken similar steps. Facebook has also been getting much better over the years at removing military proxies from its platform, and the ban in February has made this easier from a regulatory point of view. And so the military has really been relegated to fringe platforms. So the equation for the Tatmadaw now is public sentiment is overwhelmingly against it, and then it no longer has any official voice on many of these platforms. Even its proxies are having trouble getting a foothold. So this has limited its ability to even reach its own supporters. And the response has been to go into damage control. It can't win the social media war. It wants to at least try to stop its opponents from using social media to their advantage. So first we saw it blocked Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Then it began trying to restrict access to VPNs that people were using successfully to access these platforms after they'd been banned. When that didn't really work, it shut down mobile internet. And it also began prosecuting people for social media posts just to make people too scared, really, to speak out. This has had some impact. So social media was being used very successfully to organize protests and create a sense of solidarity between opposition groups. The mobile data shutdown disrupted some of that momentum because it left many people, particularly in rural areas, without any internet at all. This obviously made it hard to organize protests. We can also see from monitoring of popular Facebook groups and pages that after the mobile shutdown, interaction levels might have fallen by as much as 70%. So that gives you a sense of the impact of the shutdown. But I think one important factor that has been driving the military's actions that we sometimes don't think about or overlook is the desire to limit access to information among its own supporters, particularly soldiers and their families. So without access to social media, their only source of information often is state media, which they're forced to watch. So that's something that we often don't think about. There are many kind of factors driving the internet shutdown in Myanmar. But of course, shutting down the internet comes with significant costs as well. On the question of how the EU can use its influence, I've got a couple of quick suggestions. I think it is important to note that the hate speech dynamic has really shifted, and we should be taking that on board. As I mentioned earlier, there's a very different attitude, tone towards ethnic minorities, but most notably the Rohingya, who have been the target of a lot of hate speech in recent years, particularly in 2017 and 2018. We should be cautious about this development because the prejudices are very deep-seated. They're still there in a lot of respects and could be reactivated quite easily. But it really is an important trend, and we should be thinking about how it can be supported and strengthened. At the same time, the new targets of hate speech are emerging, and these are really difficult issues. For example, there are underground groups that are assassinating civilians who are perceived as pro-military, and these deaths are often being celebrated on social media by many people. Such is the kind of the toxic, or the level of anger towards the military. So the space for neutrality is really small now, and forms of hate speech are present on both sides. Another priority, I think, should be protecting social media users. And one way to do that is to limit the military's access to what you might call the digital tools of repression. Security forces are certainly trying to improve their use of technology to monitor opponents in real time, and also to gather information from seized devices to unravel, anti-military networks and opposition groups. But European companies have exported equipment to the security forces that could be used for this purpose in the past. So tighter restrictions are important. And just finally, before the coup, the NLD, I think, was, it's fair to say, part of the problem when it came to freedom of expression and digital rights. It prosecuted social media users, it shut down the internet in Rakhine State, and pushed mobile operators to hand over user data. And often it was doing this at the request of the military, but it still went along with the military's requests. Now the military is doing exactly the same thing to the opposition, including the NUG. So there's an opportunity to support opposition groups to develop and put forward alternative frameworks on freedom of expression and social media use and internet access that really stands in contrast to what the Tatmadaw is doing now and what has happened in the past in Myanmar. So although the NUG wouldn't have a way of implementing that right now, it's a parallel government, it's not in power, it would be a very powerful statement that could be built upon in the future, depending on how events unfold in Myanmar.
Thanks very much, Tom. That's really comprehensive. You talk about what the EU could do in the future. Myanmar seems an awfully long way away from Europe. Can you give us some examples of what the EU has done in this domain that have really made changes in the past?
In regard to social media use?
Yes, if there is such a thing. I mean, has that been a salient issue up till now?
Well, I think that I don't want to single out the EU. I mean, I think on digital rights more broadly, hasn't been a priority in the past in Myanmar, and you had different states and donors, for example, engaging with the NLD government on issues and not really taking into account how some of the programs that they were participating in with the government might have a negative effect on digital rights and on the safety of social media users, for example. So I think that's something that needs to be taken on board in future. I mean, there's not a lot of prospect for cooperation with the military regime, bilateral cooperation, but still, I think that was an area where that more could have been done in the past, and the coup has really highlighted the importance of that, I think. The other thing, the EU has taken some steps to restrict the export of equipment that could be used to violate human rights, and there's still sort of an ongoing process there to strengthen that. So I think that's positive, and more states need to follow suit, particularly when it comes to Myanmar.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks again for joining us. It's very late where you are, and we really appreciate it.
No problem.
Thanks. And now we're going to turn to Alessandro Accorsi, who is head of the Strategic Communications Task Force South at the European External Action Service, working in fact-based communication, countering disinformation, narrative positioning, and the strengthening of the overall media environment and civil society. And prior to working at the EEAS, Alessandro was a freelance journalist based in the United Kingdom and Egypt. Alessandro, you saw that in the poll that a slight majority of our audience felt that the EU could do more. And you are obviously not a government yourself, but you have a great influence on what happens. How do you see governments actively working to use social media to their advantage, either by monitoring or limiting the opposition's communications capacities or spreading their own messages? Is that something the EU does, and is that desirable, and how does that affect conflict?
Thanks for the question. My team works specifically, and thanks also for those for the poll. Actually, if you have suggestions, I very much welcome them, because they make my job easier. It's not easy at all. But my team works specifically on the MENA region, on the Middle East and North Africa, and so Jane mentioned in the opening video that the Arab Spring was called the Twitter revolution, and in the past decade, we can say that we've seen the Twitter counter revolution happening and unfolding in the region, and you can clearly see how governments realize that their old approach to propaganda, to internet shutdowns, was wrong. Not only because it was ineffective, but because they failed to understand that social media could be weaponized, as Anita also mentioned. It could be used at their own advantage, and also that it's actually a cheap tool to develop. It's something that you can develop in a kind of a cheap way. It's not expensive.
Is that me, or has Alessandro frozen? Sorry about this. We will hope to rejoin him in a second, because he can. Yes, we have a confirmation that Alessandro has frozen for the time being. Let's hope to bring him back in a second. But in the meantime, Perhaps perhaps we could go back to Jane if you're there until we will return to Alessandro as soon as he's back. Can you give us some reflections on what you think? In what way the online opinions in El Salvador are a reflection of conflict and security policy versus being a driver of them? Where would you put the role of social media in this?
Sure. I mean, I think that the question of whether social media drives or reflects conflict is one that we're grappling with as academics and practitioners across a variety of contexts. In El Salvador, what we're seeing is it being used very strategically as an exacerbator, right? This is not a passive role for social media. This is a very active role, a very strategic and top-driven role, which means that similarly it could be addressed through top-level policies. If Bukele and the opposition chose to stop using such divisive language online, it could reflect itself in how people view the administration, especially because of the central importance of Twitter in addressing, in kind of propagating these conflicts. I'm going to keep it short because I think Alessandro is back, so I'll hand it over back to him.
Thanks for that, Jane. Yes, back to you, Alessandro. Sorry, we lost you just briefly.
I'm very sorry about that. That's what happens when you're not working from home, but from the office, actually. I should have worked from home today. What I was saying is that, yeah, like technology really made it easier for state and non-state actors in the region to develop capabilities to use social media at their own advantage. And the Syrian regime was probably among the first ones to understand that. They looked at the examples of Tunisia, of Egypt, of Libya, and understood that internet shutdowns wasn't enough. When people mobilized online, then that mobilization online translated to the offline as soon as you shut it off the internet. But they understood that they could use it to their advantage. What's quite interesting is the way they did it from the start, because it's also something that is very different from all the other cases in the region. They were quick to jump from propaganda to disinformation, but instead of trying to only control their own information space, of course, they had an electronic army that was active in trolling, hacking, silencing oppositions with techniques that now most actors in the region use. While they were trying to do that, they also tried to impose a narrative. A narrative that was so in doubt in not only in Syrian audiences but also in international audiences. This was the new thing, and that was what is different about Syria compared to other cases in the region. They immediately started spreading rumors about the fact that there was no uprising, it was a foreign conspiracy, that it was just a group of terrorists that were actually trying to take over the country. And most of all, they managed to strike an unlikely coalition, an alliance with anti-imperialist, like around the anti-imperialist narrative, with both far-right groups and far-left groups in the West. Of course, like when Russia was involved, it gave a big boost to this because it brought new technologies, it brought new understanding of how to do this, and you can see that actually the Syrian disinformation techniques is basically in the hands of mostly in the hands of Russia, follows the model of Russia. But it's very interesting that Syrian disinformation is highly internationalized. It's not in the hands of Syrians anymore. Think of when was the last time that you heard a Syrian speak about Syria, or where is the Syrian narrative around the crisis and the conflict? It's all been taken away from Syrian hands, and it's something that is highly internationalized, so that Syrians are not the producers and consumers of this information. Of course, they're also subject to disinformation and misinformation, but they're not the ones who actually they're the passive beneficiaries, let's say, of that disinformation, because it falls on them. So the main objective of disinformation in this case was that was to prevent others from implementing policy. So by sowing doubt about what was happening in Syria, by sowing doubt about reasons for intervening or not intervening in Syria, about who was right, what was happening on the ground, who was responsible for things. They managed to, on one side, create space for the regime and its allies to implement certain policies and even chemical attacks. And on the other side, prevent others from implementing policies on Syria. And we see this happening all the time. Think of the chemical attacks. Think of the fact that the war is now presented as being over, as Syria is a peaceful country where there is no fighting, where everyone is fine, where everything is shiny and people can just go back. When we know that it's not the case. Last year there were protests, and they were immediately all the videos of the protests were immediately taken down by organized groups linked to the Syrian state that filed copyright infringements on YouTube, or mass-reported Twitter accounts or Facebook groups. So they're still trying to control the merging of another narrative, but at the same time, they managed to create an international narrative that not only divides any opposition, but also reduces the policy options available to make any real solution to the conflict. They make any real solution to the conflict harder to achieve, while at the same time they continue to silence, to operate as they do. So that's the main issue with the Syrian conflict. It's a conflict that is already complicated enough politically, militarily, etc. But where disinformation created an extra layer of difficulty that helped the Syrian regime actually stay in place.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. Since you are kindly joining us from the EU, and since everyone always is asking, oh, please, EU, please solve this for us, can you give us an idea relating to Syria, and especially Syrian social media? You've analyzed the situation, you've given us great observations, but what do you think that the EU can do, and what has it done to try and mitigate all these rather dreadful developments you described?
Yes, so let's say that my job is quite complicated, I have to say, and that of my team is even further complicated, as you can imagine. But we cover a region that is full of conflicts, full of active and inactive conflicts, full of tensions. What is most complicated about our region is that every country is a different information environment. But then overall, you have also an overall information environment, regional information environment given by the Arabic context. So what we do specifically in my team is try to come up with tailored strategies that are country by country and look at all the possible weaknesses of that information environment and what needs to be strengthened. It can be supporting independent media, it can be supporting civil society, it can be political pressure to have a better legislative framework, etc., etc. Now, our main pillars of work is to, and this is true to all the cases, not only on Syria, is first of all, we need to understand what is happening, because there's very little literature on what's happening and what's going on in the region. This is something I appreciated about the panel today, is that a lot of times we talk about Russia, we talk about China, but it's very hard to know actually what's going on in Myanmar, or, well, Myanmar has been covered, but it's interesting, and El Salvador and Latin America. So what we're doing is trying to understand what is happening and make sure that our policy colleagues have an informed understanding of what is going on. That's the first point for us, because wars are now fought in the information environment, but also because of what Anita said before about the unintended consequences. The EU is trying to regulate the problem, let's say, of social media inside the EU, of course, but that also means that this can have unintended consequences outside. Think, for example, of whether we would push for banning all anonymous accounts online, so that only every account in the world on social media needs to be linked to any form of ID or cell phone or something. That would mean basically that thousands of millions of users would be exposed to regimes that could easily arrest them. Activists would not be able to operate. At the same time, we need to find a balance between basically supporting that and also understanding, pushing the social media platforms to do more. Then what we also do, and this is something that we do specifically on Syria, because the main problem in Syria is that disinformation limits the space for policy action. What we do is that we try to use strategic communication not as communication for the sake of communication, but use it to maintain a space through factual information for EU policy action. To make sure that there is space for policy action by UNHCR, by the UN, by the EU, etc., to try and achieve a political solution in line with UN Security Resolution 2254. And then last pillar for us, and the most important, I would say, is that our objective is not to limit or we need to maintain this balance between limiting information operations and freedom of expression. And freedom of expression for us always wins. The problem is trying to limit the manipulative behavior on social media. And so what we're looking at is improve the overall quality of the information environments in the region by working with and empowering civil society. Which in the region was the one that actually started, this Twitter revolution, but is the one that was most hidden by the counter-revolution. Support independent media, not only financially, but also by understanding that their presence and their existence is part of an institution building process. If independent media in the region is gone, we would need to start a new institution building process that would take us 30 to 40 years to get to the point where we are today. And then last point is ensure that there are fair rules to the game for everyone. We are not saying that some actors like that we want to be the ones that take advantage of these. And no, if we're not good at communicating ourselves, or if we're not good at implementing certain policies, then it's up for audiences and for the public to decide, if they like us or not. But what is important is that there are fair rules to the game for everyone, and this is done through improving the legal environment for media, opening up space for independent media, reduce foreign manipulation, and also working with the platforms, as was mentioned by the other speakers, both to keep them accountable, but also to make sure that they work with civil society, push them to be more transparent, to apply the rules, but also to work more with local civil society. Platforms often lament that they do not have counterparts in the civil society in the region, that they can only work with governments, or that cannot work with anyone. And what we're trying to do is try to empower civil society and rebalance this triangle of power between governments, social media platforms, and civil society.
Thank you, Alessandro. That's a really clear layout of what the EU is actually doing, and I really appreciated that. And you actually answered one of our first questions on Slido. I can see other questions coming in. We're sorting them out and showing them on the screen. So please do keep submitting the questions, and you can also vote up the questions. So if you just click on the thumbs up there, it will push the question further towards the top. And you've answered one, Alessandro, and I will just quickly send you the other one. You've said that you support civil society. The specific question from the audience is, does the EU fund civil society projects in the Global South more generally to monitor and help expose these kinds of abuses on social media?
Yes, the short answer is yes. We do actually support civil society organizations and experts working on this, both in terms of independent media, fact checkers, and other. And now we're working actually to, one of the things we do is we're trying to work on tailored projects that would cover the needs of each country. Because as I said, we cover in my team at least 19 countries plus the regional environment. And so that is what complicates a little bit our job. We need to to tailor these programs to the needs of each country. So in some cases, exposure of this information works best. In other cases, it's more that what is needed is more independent media. In other cases, it's more digital security or helping independent voices be heard. Also, mainstream media limit for interventions, etc., etc.
Thank you. And just one last question from you, from the audience, Alessandro. You mentioned a bit about the strategic communications as kind of rebalance the playing field of and not allowing people to get away with saying the war was over. But can you just quickly tell us what the strategic communications for Syria that you are trying to promote is in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, it's a little bit complicated, but basically, as I said, we're not doing communication for the sake of communication. We're trying to do communication to create space for EU policy initiatives. And our EU policy on Syria is very clear. It's in line with the UN Security Resolution 2254 that says that the future of Syria is for Syrians to decide. So what we've been doing on several things, there are two main pillars, let's say. On one side, we've been working with Syrians themselves, with filmmakers, with civil society, with media, to help them tell their own story and give voice to their narrative. Because, as I said before, in this highly internationalized information environment, there are not many Syrian voices that are heard. So we've been trying to give voice to Syrians using the EU as a platform, and this is one thing. And the second thing is trying to address and expose this information when it concerns directly the EU or when it could be potentially harmful. For example, on returns of refugees, because we've seen that people might have wanted to, Syrians might have wanted to go back, or people could think that Syria was safe for returns, when we know that people are scared to go back because they could be arrested, they could be forced conscripted in the army, etc., etc. The same also on something that concerns more the EU, on European Union sanctions against the Syrian regime. That the Syrian regime claims are that we are conducting an economic war against the Syrian people, but sanctions have been in place since 2011 for a reason, and that's because the Syrian regime has used the money to repress their own people and keeps taking money away from the Syrian people to repress their own people. So we never had a problem, or we never had this information around this until the economic crisis hit in Syria, and suddenly, basically, the regime tried to shift blame on us. So we just wanted to set the record straight there and explain a little bit why we believe that sanctions need to be in place, because the conditions for political change in the country have not changed.
Thanks, Alessandro. For the next question, I think I'll put it to two of us, but if we could perhaps start with Tom Keane in Myanmar, because he's right on the front line of this. What, Tom, do you find to have been the most efficient tool against disinformation? Is it either national or international intervention or regulation, or is it ad hoc action taken by the social media platforms themselves?
Yeah, I think my experience in Myanmar would suggest it needs to be a combination of different factors. Yes, social media platforms are really important. I mean, we saw in 2017 and 2018 when Facebook was not policing content closely enough, the influence that could have. I mean, there was an explosion of hate speech towards the Rohingya. But I think, as we've discussed, I mean, independent media that's based in the country can play a really helpful role in combating disinformation. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really a combination of factors. But we do often have to be wary of the way that governments will use this issue to introduce laws to prosecute social media users. I mean, in Myanmar, just in the past 4 months, 2 laws have been amended to introduce the penalty of the crime of spreading false information or false news, and these are being used now against hundreds, maybe even more than 1,000 people so far. So that's kind of the flip side of trying to quote unquote intervention to tackle disinformation that we need to be careful of.
Thanks, Tom. And Anita, can I call on you to come in and give us your overview of what you think works best? Is it the social media platform action or the regulation and intervention by outsiders, especially governments?
I think one of the things research has taught us is that the effectiveness of these different tools is highly context dependent. So I think and this is something that of course academics like to say, but I think Thomas's point about the fact that initially there was kind of under-policing, if you could say, of posts in Myanmar being tied to the fact that there was just very little cultural and contextual knowledge within Facebook to deal with those posts. And so I think one of the things that that research does show that has a positive effect here is increasing the kind of capacity both within companies, but then also the interplay with between companies and civil society, as Alessandra was talking about. There's a lot of research right now looking at the ways in which flagging, for example, on platforms themselves related to possible disinformation might be effective or not. My sense of the current research there is that the results are very mixed. So there are instances in which flagging can draw attention to disinformation instead of kind of alerting individuals to the fact that this might be disinformation. And so I think the one-size-fits-all solution is still something that we're waiting for. But in general, the strong need for contextual knowledge by members of social media companies, having local offices, having clear communication with various civil society groups that can quickly alert the companies is very, very important.
Anita, while I've got you on, I mean, that's about disinformation. There's also something else you've worked on and written about, which is the question of the actual technology infrastructure and the internet backbone itself, and how have states used that, and how is that playing into conflicts?
So one of the things that we find more broadly when looking at the ownership, for example, of internet service providers is that the more centralized ownership is within countries, the easier it is, of course, for states or for governments themselves to control that infrastructure. And so there's a clear correlation with centralization of service provision of the internet and the ability to shut down the internet. And so that becomes a very, very dangerous mix. We also see that a lot of ISPs or internet service providers might not necessarily be owned by the state itself, but the state is able to exert a lot of pressure on those companies to still comply with their directives to shut down the internet. And so that has a big effect on the way in which political protest, for example, then plays out. One of the things I found in my own work, also doing a lot of specific work on the Syrian context, is that in situations where the government decides to leave on the internet, allow people to fully use social media, for example, to communicate, we find that in those instances, even when we control for a whole host of other factors, repression tends to be more targeted. So we see more targeting of individuals. We see clearer profiles of who's being basically targeted by the state. The flip side of that is that where the government decides to shut down the internet, and I've done extensive work here, both subnationally within Syria, nationally across time within Syria, but then also looking more globally at the role of internet outages. In general, we find a very robust relationship between internet outages and an increase in state repression, regardless of what kind of country we're looking at. And so I think the role that internet outages play in contentious politics is something that really deserves more attention.
Thanks. So just to return to Tom on that question of outages, you've experienced those directly. Does the state get any benefit from it, and how do people get around it? I mean, is it a solution for states to just shut things down?
Well, it depends on your objectives. I mean, I think when in the case of Myanmar, I mean, when establishing control and consolidating power is the only real objective that counts for the country's leaders, then an internet shutdown is they will see it as justified and necessary. But it does have huge costs. I think we've seen this in Myanmar. I mean, social and economic. And after a period, I think in Myanmar there was a realization that keeping the internet off forever for most people was not sustainable, and so the government, the military rather, has moved towards whitelisting of a number of services, so that now, for example, using mobile data, you can access Gmail, you can access Office 365, you can access mobile banking, and so on. And I think that they thought this would be a solution. You might call it an intranet or something like that, but it's proved practically quite difficult because they've whitelisted more than 1,000 services or websites now, and just the nature of how the internet works, and cloud-based servers and so on. This has resulted in a huge number of IP addresses being whitelisted, and so it's opened up loopholes to access the internet as well. I don't want to give too much detail on that, but I could have done this call from my mobile phone if I wanted to tonight. So it's very hard for a country like Myanmar, with the amount of resources Myanmar has, to keep the internet off, yet offer the services that people in a modern economy and modern society need. That's the challenge that the Myanmar military is grappling with right now.
Thank you, Tom. Technically, we were going to take a break now, but since we have lost our guest Shelby Gossman, I'm afraid, from the next session, I'd like to just carry on, let this roll on for a few more minutes, if I may. And Anita, since you're going to just stay with you, we'll have Alessandro and Jane with us for the next session. If we could take advantage of your presence once more, could you also look at this whole question of this heavy-handed approach, which seems to be even, we could say, increasingly popular amongst in countries where we study conflicts. What would your response to governments trying to do that be? What would you advise them to do?
You mean the government shutting down?
Well, what are the negative consequences of shutting it down? I mean, obviously, they feel that they're blanketing out the opposition, but as Tom is pointing out, it's very difficult, and there are serious downsides. But perhaps you have more general conclusions to draw.
Yes, I think there are a number of interesting developments that are happening in this space right now. One of them being the clear trade-off that states or governments are facing in terms of having access to information, monitoring social media, and then wanting to basically shut down all forms of communication. I like to say that because we see the intense use of internet shutdowns and actually an increase in internet shutdowns, a very kind of brutal form of censorship, when far more nuanced forms of censorship are available, is an indication that states are, or governments are, still oftentimes afraid of the kind of non-state opposition power that is drawn from social media. So I think when we kind of have this broad discussion between liberation and maybe repression technology, the fact that states are still afraid of non-state actors using social media is an indication that there is some kind of communicative power still to be had from social media, as we talked about alternative forms of accessing information, and so on and so forth. I think one of the very worrisome developments that we're seeing right now is a trend towards nationalizing internet infrastructure. So if we think about Russia, or if we think about Iran, the development of national intranets that are kind of supposed to provide access that is domestic in terms of the infrastructure that we're seeing. This is basically a situation where we're seeing a development of infrastructure that is fully capable of surveillance, that would still allow those states to basically shut off access from the World Wide Web while maintaining the type of services that Thomas was referring to in Myanmar. So, for example, financial services or domestic email services and so on and so forth. And so when we're moving towards this nationalization of infrastructure, which are called intranets, we're kind of moving towards a situation where there is no longer a trade-off between censorship and surveillance, where states are able to kind of do both at the same time. And so I think there is a real push towards this kind of, also sometimes called the Chinese model, that poses a real threat to freedom of speech and media freedom more broadly.
And not least, you have to be China to make such an intranet, because it's a pretty big undertaking, I understand. Anyway, thanks very much to this really enlightening first panel. I'm told that we do need to move on now. So Anita and Tom, thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciated your time and your insights. And Alessandra and Jane, thanks for staying on for our next panel, which will be about the other side of the coin, the non-state actors and how they're using things. So thank you, and we will join you again after the break. Alessandra, I'll be coming to you first. So I'm ready. Hello again. You're back with International Crisis Group's panel on the use of social media by state and non-state actors. We've just spent the last hour talking about how the state actors are working in this domain, and now we're going to switch over to the non-state side. We're also going to, as I introduce Alessandro, we have a fourth poll on the Slido function, which if you've just joined us, it's on the below the screen on the Crisis Group website page, or you can go to slido.com and enter #ICG, and you can both answer the polls there and the poll questions there, and we will also have some questions after the panelists have joined us. And on this panel we have Alessandro Corsi, Jane Esberg, and Are Ntui joining us to talk about Syria, Venezuela, and Cameroon, all from a perspective of the non-state actors. Alessandro, who will join us first, is the head of the Strategic Communications Task Force South at the European External Action Service, covering, I believe, 19 countries, mostly in MENA, and he works on fact-based communication, countering disinformation, narrative positioning, and the strengthening of the overall media environment and civil society. So, Alessandro, you've told us about the state side of the social media picture and a very great overview of what the EU is doing. When you turn your attention to the non-state narratives in the area of your responsibility, what are you seeing? What can you do? Are you seeing a heightened role of expatriates, international networks, and how impactful are non-state actors on what's going on in your area of responsibility?
I would say that there are two kinds of non-state actors in our region. On one side, I would put civil society. That's for sure, like the civil society activists, independent media, anyone who has an independent voice, actually, even researchers and analysts are part of that group. And on the other side, I would put malign non-state actors, because we have quite a few in the region. The interesting thing is, as I mentioned before, that this information allows for any organized group to actually develop capabilities of some sort of using this information in a way or another. They can be more or less sophisticated, but the entry point for to use this information has been lowered and lowered over the years. So if you have some money, if you have some resources and organization, and sometimes if you have a sponsor, you can easily use that kind of techniques to actually play this information game. So when it comes to the malign non-state actors, we've seen, for example, in some contexts like Libya, armed groups, militias, political parties that have used this information in as a way of continuing their political infighting or military infighting. At the beginning of the Tripoli offensive, for example, all the actors on the ground used this information as a way of even advancing by inches on the ground. There was a lot of misinformation that was spread around to confuse the other militias, to actually play psychological operations, but also to foment hate speech, hatred, polarization that made any ceasefire even harder to achieve. And the problem there was that every little actor had some capacity of doing so. The other thing that happened that was extremely worrying for us, and I would say was even more worrying than the use of information operations on the military side, is the fact that anyone who didn't take a position was silenced and targeted. So all the civil society actors, all those independent voices, who would try to make sense of what was going on, who were trying to even just give simple fact-based information. An independent journalist, analyst, Libyan or non-Libyan, was harassed to the point or threatened, blackmailed, their data stolen, threats to them, to their families, to the point that they basically gave up on engaging on social media, and that left the hole basically. So because the whole space was just filled by disinformation and by polarizing views from both sides, and that increased the polarization in the country, increased the hate speech, increased the conflict dynamics. So it made things worse. But we've seen the same thing happening in Iraq, for example, where militias and non-state actors use technology and social media to coordinate attacks, to try and silence critics or try and silence independent voices, to push them to one side or to simply silence them. And one of the problems in our region is that online threats rarely stay only as online threats. Disinformation in the Middle East kills people. Jamal Khashoggi is the most famous example, but over the years we have had several examples of social media personalities, influencers, analysts, others who have been either killed or forced to exile or forced to retire basically from social media and be completely silenced. In Iraq, for example, we have Tara Fares, who was a model and social media personality, and she was killed. Isham al-Hashimi, who was a security analyst. And all those operations were fomented and coordinated on social media. There were groups, close groups that were active in fomenting hate against those personalities, so that waiting for someone to strike. But then the actual operations, it seems that that led to their killing were actually also coordinated on close messaging groups. And then there is let's say the big non-state actor in our region, which is Daesh and terrorist actors. And there it's quite interesting because Daesh at the height of their power were very good at using propaganda and using social media to spread their own messaging. And there was a lot of attention given by platforms, by the EU, the states in general, to take down extremist content online, to reduce the space for this terrorist propaganda, to extremist propaganda to spread. What they've done now, how their tactics changed is the fact that with all the noise that is generated by these information operations that are run by state and non-state actors, Daesh can manage to actually run their own operations virtually undetected. There's so much noise that is generated, the volume of tweets, of information that is generated so high that it's basically almost impossible to detect them and to pick them. And also there's less attention on the side of social media platforms, who were basically shifted some of their resources from the anti-extremist content to larger information operations. And then on the civil society side, the situation is quite bleak, to be honest, because there is not the same level of organization, and every basically state actor in the region has focused on making sure that there is no other Arab Spring, or at least I believe that the Arab Spring is still continuing. It's an ongoing process, but that there cannot be another Twitter revolution. So every time that we've seen protests emerging in the region, I'm thinking of Lebanon, for example, or Iraq itself, there have been efforts by state and non-state actors to divide the opposition, to silence civil society, to create influencers even that appeared out of nowhere and that were trying to manipulate public opinion. And so to make sure that civil society could not gather that critical mass that was necessary to actually push for change and for democratic reforms. So they're organizing, but the problem is that there's so much repression online and offline that it's very hard for them to actually do something significant. Jean-Marc Khashoggi was actually one of those who tried to push for this with a project, and we know what happened to him. So that's one of the problems that disinformation kills. So even when civil society in the region tries to organize itself, faces offline repression as well.
So we've opened up a new poll asking whether the EU and international actors can do more to fight disinformation and support Alessandro in his efforts. Alessandro, you do fill out the poll, and we currently have 100% yes, they should do more. So believing in your mission, but Alessandro, it's not all bullying and hatred. I mean, we've had a breakthrough in Libya, which did happen to some extent online, didn't it? There was a kind of digital campaign. Is that something the EU had anything to do with? I know it was under the UN umbrella. Did you support that? Is that something you think can be replicated? Is there something in that it offers a light at the end of the tunnel?
We're working in general to empower civil society, to give them a space to also organize, to give them a space to be empowered to address some of the needs. The problem is really that each context is different, and we've seen it for Israel-Palestine, for example, with the incitement, with the suppression of speech, etc. One of the big problems is also that on the side of the social media platforms is that their models are based on Western audiences, and they do not have, as we said also before, they do not have a real understanding of the local context, but also that the flagging method of flagging content online is really based on a behavior that is present in the US and in Europe. But civil society do not have access to data, do not have access to being able to push these campaigns. And every time that they try to organize a larger campaign, there is pushback from the other side. And so this is one of the problems. On Libya specifically, we are working with the UN to try and take down content, to try and mitigate the effect of disinformation, and trying to provide as much analysis as possible and support to civil society. Some civil society also prefers not to take down content because they want to be able to foresee the moves of their opponents. But in general, this is what we're trying to do.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And at this point, with 9 respondents, we have 100% support for you doing more. So good luck with that. Thanks. I have many more questions for you, Alessandro, but I'll come back after we've heard from our next respondent, who will be Jane, and she's going to talk to us about Venezuela. For those of you who have just joined us, Jane is our fellow on economics of conflict, and she's our incoming crisis group senior analyst for social media and conflict. She's also a visiting fellow at Princeton University. So thanks, Jane. We've heard views on what the state side of it is, especially looking at El Salvador in the first panel, but opposition and non-state groups, including rebels and criminals and criminal groups, have increasingly turned to social media to communicate not just amongst themselves, but with the wider public. And how is that shaping the conflict context you're examining here?
Sure. I mean, so I'm going to be talking about Venezuela, which I think it's actually, I'm going to be talking about kind of a pessimistic aspect of how social media has shaped conflict in Venezuela among the opposition. But I think that this is actually overall an optimistic story because social media has really shaped how opposition, and particularly opposition in exile, can communicate among themselves and communicate to citizens within Venezuela. It's been a concerted effort by the Maduro government to push opposition out of the country. They've joined 5 million Venezuelans in fleeing. Because of that, it's a tactic specifically designed to fracture the opposition physically. Social media has been incredibly important in allowing these opposition politicians and activists the ability to communicate with citizens back home. And it's offered a way of getting around issues of media freedom in Venezuela that have been very persistent. So with that, out-migration from Venezuela is really one of the defining features of the crisis, and this includes these activists that have been forced into exile. And in our research, we show that actually leaving Venezuela changes how activists express themselves online and makes them more likely to criticize the government in harsh terms and post approvingly about aggressive foreign policies. So even though there's this very positive effect of allowing them to communicate, exile is also worsening polarization among the Venezuelan opposition. And the dynamics of social media are likely exacerbating this polarization even further. And this in turn makes a kind of unified opposition that will be necessary for the kind of negotiations that Crisis Group has really been promoting for years much more difficult. So since taking power in 2013, Maduro has obviously violated human rights widely, including extrajudicial killings, and overseen a worsening and incredibly intense humanitarian crisis, including the resurgence of preventable diseases, blackouts, gas shortages. And one consequence of this is that many millions of Venezuelans have fled abroad, and this effectively has scattered the opposition as well, because activists are being forced to flee, so that it's forced to operate across borders and with a large diaspora population. Since a failed attempt to lead a military uprising in April 2019, Juan Guaido, who's the leader of the opposition, has faced growing internal division. More conciliatory factions view negotiations with the government as the best way to restore democracy and alleviate the humanitarian crisis. More intransigent parts of the opposition believe that coercive pressure by outside powers is the most reliable way to achieve the same goals. And in that context, social media, as I mentioned, just an incredibly important tool for Venezuela. As more and more people operate from abroad and pursue activism from abroad, these platforms are really critical for communication. And this includes with international actors like the EU. But there's a pretty widespread perception that opposition become more willing to embrace extreme positions online when they move abroad. In a personal essay, a Venezuelan exile described this as toxic exile, which is defined as someone who, warped by the trauma of exile, adopts political views detrimental to the people back home. And that means that leaving is this politically transformative experience that divides in-country activists from those that live abroad. To study this more systematically, we analyzed 5 million tweets by 357 activists, 94 of whom left the country. Venezuela has one of the highest rates of Twitter penetration in the world, and the lack of independent media really makes this a key metric. So we tracked two themes of interest. One was stringent criticism, and the other was calls for aggressive foreign action. So stringent criticism included references to fascism, narco-trafficking by the state, and Cuban or Russian interference in Venezuela, so like the pointiest end of criticism. All of these have some basis in truth, but they're just the kind of sharpest set of criticisms that target Maduro. Calls for aggressive foreign action include references to sanctions and military intervention. So I'm going to show a graph on Slido that shows how the crisis changes after Venezuela, how reactions to the crisis online change after Venezuelan opposition go into exile. So while discussions of both foreign action and stringent criticism of the regime have gone up over time among all the opposition, the rise is being driven in part by the fact that exiles have become much more likely to take more extreme positions after leaving. So the 0 month is the month that they leave, and you see this increase following this. So this graph shows that in the 6 months before and after leaving the country, relative to activists who remained in Venezuela, exiles become significantly more likely to harshly criticize the government, which is shown on the top, and they're also more publicly supportive of aggressive foreign intervention, including sanctions and intervention. So by contrast, which we don't show here, but references to service provision, so Venezuela's frequent gas shortages, blackouts, and medical crises fall as a share of tweets, suggesting that exiles are less likely to discuss these uniquely kind of domestic problems and more likely to focus on topics that are of interest to international communities. And there are a number of reasons for this. So leaving allows opposition members to actually speak more freely without fearing persecution, which does happen on the basis of things that are said online. They're socialized into new communities that might already hold really firm preferences. So as one U.S. former official described, when Venezuelans are in exile, especially in the US, they're exposed to their own radicals, basically, in the diaspora. And exiled leaders may grow disconnected from the priorities of those who remain in the country, just as a result of not actually experiencing those kind of domestic effects. But social media is also contributing to this because it often rewards more hardline rhetoric. So when they leave, exiles join these existing diaspora communities, and exiles and commenters have reported being harassed online if they express an opinion that's perceived as too moderate, that might further intensify polarization. All of this really matters because exiles are highly influential, especially in Venezuela, and Twitter is an important means for disseminating opinions, both to foreign actors and within the country, especially given limitations on independent media. So an exiled politician said that influential Venezuelan Twitter users condition with success, often success, local politics. And this matters a lot for the Venezuelan crisis because unity among the opposition will be really crucial to any type of negotiated settlement in Venezuela that actually allows us some semblance of freedom of elections, or at least that allows us some degree of exit from the worsening humanitarian crisis. And I think that this case really exemplifies this double-edged sword that we've talked a lot about in the context of social media, that it's really transformed how civil society actors and opposition actors can communicate online, but it is also increasing polarization and conflict, and not only through disinformation, but through propaganda and just through kind of reaffirming voices that are perhaps more hardline. So thank you.
Thanks, Jane. That you've described really well the double-edged sword that I think that the social media is, both as a really important enabler and the way it can cut also on the other side. You say these expatriates are mostly in the United States, and yet at the same time, Europe always has this very surprisingly salient role in Venezuela. Are there Venezuelan expatriates in Europe? Is there a European role in all this? Is there anything the EU can do?
I mean, definitely. So there are a lot of Venezuelans in the United States, but there are also a lot in Spain, in other parts of Europe, in Colombia. The diaspora has really internationalized the crisis in a way that's made it really kind of everybody's issue. And so in that case, there is a lot more that the EU can do and really has been doing. The EU has been really central in the little bit of opening that we've seen in terms of providing humanitarian assistance within Venezuela. On the online aspect in particular, I think part of this is thinking, in this case, what's kind of fascinating about the Venezuelan opposition is that they're certainly not breaking any moderation policies on Twitter, right? They're certainly not saying anything that would get them deplatformed. They're just expressing a range of viewpoints, but in a way that might be a bit more provocative after they leave the country. And because of that, I think that this is actually a case where the EU's influence can be strongest offline. This means basically talking to a wide range of actors who hold a variety of viewpoints, making sure to talk to people who are actually operating in the country. I think that one of the kind of effects of exile is that exiles are just much more proximate to foreign governments. This makes sense. It's hard to travel into and out of Venezuela for many of the opposition. And what that means is that exile voices are often more proximate and are very important to listen to. This is not a knock on exiles at all. They have an incredibly important role. But it's also important to make sure that we balance this with voices that are in the country and who have seen the deteriorating humanitarian situation firsthand as well. And so this is a case where I think that the EU can really prioritize getting a wide range of voices involved in these discussions, and where the influence on pressuring platforms or influencing online rhetoric is important insofar as with all kind of instances of negotiation and mediation and conflict, we are cognizant of disinformation and the kind of tone of information that's being spread.
Thank you, Jane. And if anyone really wants to follow up on that Venezuela issue, there's an excellent essay by Jane on on our website, crisisgroup.org. Just go to the Venezuela page and you'll soon find it. And moving on now to Cameroon, where I would like to introduce our third speaker in this panel, who's Ari Ndui, who joined Crisis Group just a couple of years ago in 2019 as our senior analyst for Cameroon. He focuses particularly on the Anglophone conflict, but also national socio-political tensions and wider threats to security in Cameroon. Prior to joining Crisis Group, Ari was a diplomat. He worked as head of political section at the British High Commission in Yaoundé. Before a decade in diplomacy and international development, he served as managing editor for an educational publisher with footprints in Cameroon, Nigeria, and Ghana. Ari studied business administration at Heriot-Watt University and international relations at the University of London. Ari, for some reason, Cameroon is always with me because I watched the Crisis Group social media feed, and the Cameroonian activists of all kinds always tag crisisgroup.org. So I've been exposed to the vitriolic level of conversation that there is with ghastly pictures coming up all the time. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your explanation of what's going on as these non-state groups, opposition groups, rebel and criminal groups have turned to social media to communicate with an audience that definitely includes us. And what's the impact overall beyond the small aspect of my own Twitter feed?
Okay, thank you, Hugh. Firstly, the situation in Cameroon, we have two slightly different situations. First, we have the crisis or conflict, separatist conflict in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon, which started off with peaceful protest, but a lot of this was driven on social media. A lot of the activists were working on social media. So the conflict, the crisis has kind of had a social media, a very strong social media footprint from 2016 and 2017, early days of that crisis. But on the second stage, we also have what we can term more generally as central political and ethnic tensions, which is not related to the Anglophone crisis in the west of the country, but it's more about the crisis, the tensions, the competition to succeed Mr. Biya at the helm of the country, which has pitted the opposition, mainly led by Maurice Kamto, and the incumbent president, Paul Biya, who has been on seat since 1982. So these two is also creating a very strong social media footprint. Let me start first briefly with the Anglophone crisis to just show a bit of what non-state armed groups are doing there to shape conflict. Well, first, the non-state armed groups in the Anglophone region, so we can refer to them as armed separatists. How have they used social media? How are they using social media? One, they are publicizing their political cause. They're using social media to raise support, but also because of the interactive nature of social media, they are using it to engage with their audiences. They are obtaining live feedback in a way that will not be possible for social media. And just to note, the principal social media platform being used in Cameroon generally, particularly in the Anglophone regions, is Facebook. Non-state armed groups are also running internet TV. Most of these in the early days were based solely on social media. You can talk of SABC, which is Southern Cameroon's Broadcasting Corporation. You also have something from a rival separatist organization, the ABC, Ambazonia Broadcasting Corporation. They also have more recently ABN, Ambazonia Broadcasting Network. Fourth thing that they do with these groups do with social media, they use it to raise funds. This partly explains why we have so many vitriolic, violent videos of sometimes of attacks, sometimes of atrocities, torture of civilians or the direct participants in the conflict. It could be the separatists or soldiers. You have those things on social media, partly because the groups are trying to use it not just for propaganda, there's a lot of propaganda, but also to use it to demonstrate their effectiveness as part of their fundraising strategy. For those who know a bit about the crisis, you remember that a lot of the Anglophone leaders, who are now also called separatists, are out of the country. Some fled the country long ago, but more recently, just as the crisis was beginning to take shape in 2016 and 2017, another sort of Anglophone leaders left. A lot of these people are out of the country, in the US, in Europe, in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Ghana, in other parts of the world. And they look up to see these videos. The armed groups on the field use these videos to kind of demonstrate their capability and to justify their use of funds. So it's a kind of fundraising strategy also. A lot of these videos are also for propaganda. It's also messaging to the state authorities, to the government, on the levels of violence that the non-state armed groups are also able to perform. A lot of it is also just about fear-mongering, to spread fear, to spread threats against other people. But in the case where these videos were posting on social media is being used to expose atrocities, or on the one side, it appears to be a very negative use of social media. But the other argument is that in an environment where normal traditional media like the print, TV, and audiovisual are not being allowed by the authorities to fully report what's happening in the conflict, social media, especially Facebook and partly Twitter, are now the principal ways by which people are expressing themselves, are exposing some of the really terrible things that are happening to them inside this conflict. For analysts, for media houses, for professionals, for those who are studying conflict, without some of these publications, without some of these sometimes very gruesome videos, without some of these live attack videos, there will be very little information on the nature of the conflict that's happening in the Anglophone regions. So there is a hard balancing act to try to make there. In addition, the non-state armed groups use social media to also threaten opponents, rivals. There's a lot of division. Sometimes it changes depending on which epoch you are looking at the crisis in the Anglophone regions. There have been times where the groups are more closely linked. They are more united in their purpose and focus. Other times, it's almost some cacophony, and everyone is trying to do their own thing, and they're more interested in outpacing the other group. So they use videos to ridicule other groups, to demonstrate that maybe one group is the one which is more active, which is more engaged, and also trying to place themselves, market themselves politically. So in a nutshell, that's how these groups are using social media in the Anglophone crisis. But when you come to the more central political scene, where it's more about political and ethnic tensions, mostly between the supporters of the current president, Paul Biya, and the main opposition person, Maurice Kamto, who each come from different ethnocultural parts of the country. Social media is being used more as a vehicle of hate speech, The activists on social media are using a lot of inflammatory language, sometimes very incendiary. We've got a lot of fake news also. And some people were bystanders in the beginning when this political any disputes started, because of the mass of this information on social media, especially on Facebook, are now beginning to take interest. The activists are building consciousness around this, and this has kind of broken down Cameroonian society almost in like camps, although it has not transformed into a widespread or regular violence offline, actually. But a lot of what's happening on social media is actually some reflection of the things and frustrations that people have offline, and sometimes they do not have the means to express themselves because the media is very tightly controlled in the country. With the anonymity that social media now provide for people, people go onto social media to express their anger against the government, to attack some people whom they will not be able to readily attack in daily life offline. So it's a slightly different scenario in Cameroon, depending on which of the crises or which of the situations you look at. But what we can simply draw as a conclusion is that social media has given a voice. It's a tool for organization. It's a very strong political tool for non-state groups, and it now gives them some sort of leverage also against the government, which still has very, very strong control of traditional media.
Ari, that was fascinating. You've given me some explanations about the scenes that come up in my feed, and I have to agree with you on one point, is that I did not get how violent it was until I saw those things in my feed, and it really opened my eyes to what people are facing in Cameroon. Obviously, the Anglophone side of the conflict in Cameroon, this is very much a child of Europe's previous colonial past in Cameroon, with the British on one side and the French on the other. Is there any current connection to Europe that we can highlight for our European policy audience? Is there something that European states or the EU could do to mitigate what the bad side of what you're talking about? And also, if you think that it's more about the social media companies, please come up with any ideas you'd have for them as well.
Okay, thank you. I think it's both. There are things which the EU can handle or support or be a sponsor to. But we also have things which more readily fall in the plate of the social media companies concerned, principally Facebook and but also Twitter increasingly. EU, I think some EU countries have shown interest in the problematic of misinformation and hate speech in the country. But we also find ourselves in an environment in Cameroon where civil space has reduced drastically as a result of all these tensions and threats to the unity and stability of the country, which the government is facing, but also because of the government's earlier predisposition to try to limit the expression of the opposition. So they will have to try to balance the act, but there's a lot that can be done by supporting institutions to try to moderate. And we'll talk about institutions here. There are concerns that if partners try to get the government to get too involved in regulating social media, it might be counterproductive, because that might mean that the space for people expressing themselves reduces even further by a more hardline approach from the government. So maybe the route to go is to work with the civil society in the country, also work with the political parties who have done very little or almost nothing at all to kind of rein in on their supporters, who are most of the purveyors of this hate speech online in Cameroon, especially regarding the political and ethnic tensions. But in the Anglophone crisis, for example, there's a sort of feeling that maybe we've gotten past the stage where trying to control or moderate social media better can have a significant benefit to the situation on the ground. Because as you might know, there was a time in 2017 when the government cut down internet to the Anglophone regions for 3 months. It did not stop the crisis from developing. Actually, arguably, it radicalized more people. There are times when the networks have been slowed down in Cameroon to try to reduce the propagation of some of this kind of vitriolic posting on the internet. But these have not had real impact on the ground. So maybe the EU should look at actually working with the Cameroonian institutions, civil society, and the opposition groups, both in the Anglophone areas, but also in the central political scenario, to actually address the offline drivers of some of these disputes, which have now been converted and are being expressed as online hate speech, as a promotion and call for violence online. The other thing that the EU could do is to promote engagement between social media companies and the government. The relationship between these two has not been great. Maybe if the EU can add its political voice, it might be something that might help. But also to support political parties, specifically to develop guidelines for their own users, maybe to try to bring in more responsible social media users in the country.
Thanks, Harry. We're opening up to questions on the floor. We have a first question for Ari, which I'll pass on to in a moment. We have 8 more minutes, so push them through if there's anything more that you'd like to know from our excellent and esteemed guests, panelists. But Ari, before I turn to you with the question, well, Ari, let's go straight to it. I mean, do you think that social media can be used to stimulate dialogue among communities and even produce a reverse dynamic, easing violent rhetoric? Have you seen any examples of that? Do you think it could happen, and how?
Yeah, it's possible to get that but we should also note that some of the work of this, the preponderance of this online activists has actually, in some respects, stifled debate because the other side, one of the dark sides of social media is social media lynching, which has led to many people recoiling and not expressing themselves freely, especially in situations where there are armed groups which are operating and who can actually draw links between what's happening, what people say politically online, and to on-the-ground action. So yes, perhaps things can be done in that light. But I think the basis actually in the Cameroon scenario is to start by addressing the drivers of these tensions for the central political and ethnic issues, but in the Anglophone regions, to actually look at the root causes of the conflict, of the crisis, of the dispute. Without that, just having some form of social media promotion or reengineering to get people maybe to be a bit more cautious about what they do may actually have a little benefit, because I think we've missed the point where those sort of actions could be done. I think a bit more now needs to be done. A lot of it has to happen offline, and then carried from offline to the online space, and then to build for there. And then we can build vice versa, a kind of motion in both sides, say online and offline, and the two moving together to create a kind of synergy.
Thanks. Alessandro, you've been listening to what Ari's been saying about the offline potential. I'm thinking of what we heard about what happened in Libya, where the UN mission there engaged actors from across the political spectrum on social media and helped produce a code of ethics to turn down hateful and unacceptable content. Also, when it came to the actual discussions on a new Libyan, I hesitate to say constitution, but an article of the ceasefire anyway, and there was an anti-hate speech provision in there. Is there any, from what you're hearing from Ari saying about Cameroon, is there a role for outsiders like the EU to try and push such ideas offline and hope that they will transfer on?
I think it's definitely a new frontier for both track 2 diplomacy and for conflict mediation. The idea of pushing actors who are responsible for I mean, this is what we would do offline, you know, like when you're trying to mediate in a conflict and try to reduce risk and violence, you try to bring people together. I'm a little bit personally pessimistic about the option of using social media to kind of de-escalate tension. I don't think that social media works well to unpolarize because it creates polarization as it is. But I do think that offline engagement and engagement with different actors to bring them together to agree on a code of ethics, to agree to de-escalate tensions can actually work, and it does work in some cases.
Thanks. And we're going to be wrapping up in a few minutes, so I'm going to pass one more question to Jane, and that is from one of our members of the audience. Was struck by your comment about 5 million tweets, which I guess is a methodological question of how on earth do you manage to analyze so many tweets and make sense of them. And while you're talking, I would really like, we've heard a lot about the polarization drive of social media. And yet one interesting thing you said about Venezuela is that you came out optimistic that in fact, social media was a force that somehow was helping in overall. So while answering the 5 million, within two minutes or so, why do you remain optimistic?
So sure, I'll start with a methodological question. I mean, I think that, it's shameless self-promotion now, but I think that this is one of the reasons that it's good to have quantitative social scientists around, because it offers an alternative way of analyzing social media and other conflicts, on and offline, compared to qualitative research, which is also incredibly important, but which gives you one particular perspective. And what we could do with the 5 million tweets was basically automatically do a content analysis based on a kind of dictionary of words. And this is actually something that social media companies have been promoting, is the use by academics and civil society of their platforms for data collection. So Twitter has a very now open academic API that allows you to basically collect tweets. Facebook has CrowdTangle, which lets you kind of use a search term and automatically download public Facebook posts with that information. And that's been an incredibly useful tool for doing this kind of bigger overarching analysis of social media. That doesn't replace qualitative analysis of social media. I think that is really where you have to do the sniff test and make sure that you understand it in reality. But I think that a quantitative analysis of this sort can be a useful way of understanding the scope of the problem and the kind of levels. In terms of the kind of broader question about optimism about social media, I mean, I try to remain optimistic that social media is overall this extremely democratizing effect on political communication. And I think that in many places that is good. I think that social media companies can still do more to kind of exploit this and promote this. Ari really opened my eyes in the Cameroon case to the incredible power of verification as a tool of making sure that opposition voices are heard. In Venezuela, I think that the fact that we now have exile communities speaking so freely and constantly among one another is overall good. It means that when people leave home, which is often, the result of many crises across the world, not just Venezuela, huge diaspora populations, it means better communication among families. It means activism from abroad in areas where people inside the country might feel unsafe. And of course, there are also the effects of being able to coordinate around protest, being able to spread information. But, as we've said again and again, it's a double-edged sword. And I think what really comes through in the panel again and again is how context specific it is, which is both a challenge and an opportunity. We often talk about the role of social media as this kind of top line thing that, changes in the algorithm or changes in what news content gets promoted, but that the effects of those changes are going to vary widely across countries. Particularly armed groups, when we're talking about and non-state actors, are extremely adaptable in their responses to these kinds of policy changes. So understanding the effects of those, even top-level policy changes, is really going to be important to have country-level research of the type that we've heard on this panel, the Crisis Group does, and understanding those effects. And the use of social media in particular context is really how we build policy around social media in general, I think. So I have really enjoyed learning more about all of these conflicts, and I think that this is the kind of research that can get us to really better understanding these conflict dynamics and the relationship to social media.
Well, as we all have, thank you very much, Jane, for wrapping it up on a somewhat optimistic note, and thank you, Ari, for bringing us that really important local detail from Cameroon, and to Alessandro for really opening my eyes to what the EU can and is doing, and very specifically as well, which is we're always very grateful for. To our audience, please linger on for a few minutes if you're still there to give us a little readout on what you found out about this. I'm glad to see that the first two respondents learned a lot, and we're always open to any other private messages as well. So thank you all, thank you, dear panelists, and we hope to meet you on other crisis talks in the future. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.